Galilean tradition. Not surprisingly, Christian scholars do not accept that Jesus can be seen simply in the light of such traditions. Dr. Anthony Harvey, Canon of Westminster, believes that Dr. Vermesch may have underestimated the prevailing forces of expectation and the messianic opportunities it presented.
Fact is, I think that he's left something vital out of his portrait of Jesus. Something that simply doesn't fit into the charismatic Jew category at all. And this is a belief which Jesus shared with a great many of his contemporaries, but which colored all his teaching and preaching. The belief, I mean, that the present world order was not destined to go on much longer, that there was soon to be a radical change. In their own language, that God's kingdom was at hand.
While Jesus was reaching the height of his fame in Galilee, a most brutal and insensitive Roman took charge of Palestine. This stone, bearing his name, was recently discovered in Caesarea. Pilatus, Pontius Pilate. From Josephus we know that on one night in Jerusalem, Pilate ordered his men to march into the temple itself. They carried standards bearing the image of the divine emperor, blasphemy to the Jews, and only one of several deliberate acts of provocation.
Anthropologists know this as well as historians do, that whenever a traditional culture and religion is threatened by a colonial power with a different set of values, that's exactly when you're likely to have a messianic movement. But when such a movement takes place, people can't usually say exactly what sort of Messiah they're expecting. How could they? The one thing they're really sure about is that something is going to happen. Some great change is just over the horizon. Now, there's evidence that beliefs of this kind were causing a good deal of excitement in the time of Jesus.
Canon Harvey believes that although Jesus declined to take on the warrior role of Messiah, he utilized the intensity of expectation to put across his vision of the kingdom of God, in which a Messiah would not act by force. In short, Jesus reinterpreted his compatriots' beliefs.
He refused to take those beliefs as he found them. He changed them, made them more realistic, or should I say more consistent with the character and purposes of God as he understood them. For God works not by force but by persuasion. And so the new age must be brought about not by violence but by love.
Some evidence for how Jesus may have tried to focus attention on the new age lies in one of the best attested stories about him, his triumphant entry into Jerusalem. Every year there was a ceremonial palm-waving rededication of the temple to celebrate its liberation from pagan abuse nearly 200 years earlier.
People have sometimes thought that Jesus just got mixed up in the annual celebration of that event, when people were carrying palms anyway. But I believe that this ignores the fact that Jesus was doing a most extraordinary thing. When you approach a holy place on a holy day, you go on foot. That is a fundamental religious instinct. And it was certainly the case as regards Jerusalem. Even recently, in 1917, General Allenby dismounted before entering Jerusalem at the head of the British Army. But Jesus, having walked all the way up from Jericho, deliberately and ostentatiously mounted to enter Jerusalem. Admittedly, it was a donkey that he mounted, so it was hardly a royal procession, and yet it was an extraordinary thing to do, and I don't believe that anyone could have made this story up. I think we must have here a recollection of an actual event. But what did it mean? Was it a claim to a new kind of kingship? Was it a gesture in the direction of a new kind of religion? Certainly many people who saw it, instead of being scandalized by it, as we might expect them to have been, saw it as something to do with God. Indeed, it was in ways such as this that they came to see Jesus as having something to do with God also. I can't, of course, prove that they were right. But I think that the evidence does allow us to say that this was the kind of question which Jesus posed to his contemporaries, and still poses to us.
Alongside the Jewish tradition of popular charismatics and messianism, there was another factor at work, influencing the nature of first-century Jewish spirituality and religious practice: the occult. It's now known that there existed sects within Judaism that practiced secret mystical initiation as a means of obtaining communion with God. Morton Smith, professor of ancient history at Columbia University in New York, is an authority on ancient occult religious practices and has put forward a controversial theory of his own about Jesus. It was inspired by a remarkable discovery which he made here at the monastery of Mar Saba in the Judean desert. He first came to the monastery as a Harvard divinity student in 1942. He was struck by the ritual and power of the daily liturgy, which he found reminiscent of the techniques of the ancient Jewish mystics he was then studying. Mystics who, by a process of self-hypnotic chanting, deliberately induced the spiritual sensation of ascending to heaven. The chanting of the monks seemed equally hypnotic. Smith began to wonder whether there might be a common source.
I came back to the monastery in 1958. This time, I was chiefly interested in the uncatalogued manuscripts in the monastery's libraries, of which the chief one was in the top of the tower that dominates the monastery. It was there I made my discovery. On the end papers of a 17th century book, I found written of text, which this is a facsimile, which really amazed me. It was a copy of a letter by a very early church father, Clement of Alexandria, to somebody called Theodore, and Clement quoted a secret Gospel of Mark, which he said had been written by Mark himself for use only by an inner circle of initiates. Now, unfortunately, forgeries of ancient letters are common, particularly letters by church fathers. So the first thing I had to do was to find out whether or not this text was genuine. Eventually, rather to my surprise, the evidence turned out to show that the text pretty certainly was authentic. I had to be so careful because the text implies that Jesus himself practiced some sort of secret nocturnal initiation. This is what Clement quotes of the secret gospel.
Jesus rolled away the stone from the door of the tomb, and straightway, going in where the youth was,